Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. Today's solo flight special is being captained by Randy Wright. Ground traffic control has moved us to the departure lane, and we will be taking off shortly. Please return all seat backs to their original position, and ensure that all tray tables are stowed in the locked and upright position. Now fasten your seat belts. Kick back, relax, and enjoy the show as we soar above the friendly airwaves in comfort and style. Once again, we thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. This is your captain speaking, and I would like to take this opportunity to personally welcome you to this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. We know you have a choice when it comes to your radio listening pleasure, and would like to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. What's more, we are confident that no other radio program or venue will fly you over the friendly airwaves in as much comfort and style, nor leave you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment, quite like we can here at the Wright Flyer. Now that you're aboard, please be seated, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show. We've taxied to the departure lane and are awaiting takeoff clearance from air traffic control. While they go through that mindless, bureaucratic red tape and regimentation, I'm going to go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist because there is a lot of news and information to get to before I may indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, now that we are reeling from those horrific terrorist shootings that occurred in San Bernardino, California, we are once again forced to ask ourselves where our leadership was and is. Ever since this wave of terrorism has been gripping the Western world since those horrific attacks in Paris, France, followed up by the terrorist shootings at San Bernardino, California, it once again seems that the Obama regime is following their naked emperor who is drunk and asleep behind the wheel. This has placed the entire United States of America, and indeed the entire Western world, at an extreme disadvantage. Everything that we know and love in this country has come under a direct and deliberate attack, and yet the political powers that be are sticking their heads in the sand, refusing to admit that the United States is facing an actual terrorist threat. Now, Saeed Farouk, the mastermind behind those dastardly terrorist attacks, is someone whom the administration went out of their way to try and downplay his connections with terrorism. You've seen it with Obama and Loretta Lynch going out and focusing on all of the wrong issues with respect to this terrible, terrible crisis that is facing the United States. They once again want to grab our firearms instead of focusing on Islamo-fascist terrorism, which is the real threat that we're facing right now. Folks, Jeremy and I have often reiterated on past episodes of the Wright Flyer that the most important service that we can render to you, our cherished listening passengers and audience, is to provide you with the tools necessary so that you may gain a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. Part of the reason that we say that this is such an important duty and responsibility and service on our part is because it empowers you to see what the real dangers are in this country. But not only that, it also provides you with the insight to understand the methodology which can be applied in order to return the United States to a sense of normalcy. It is impossible to destroy every vestige of terrorism. That's why I don't like the idea of referring to this fight that we have against Islamo-fascists as a war on terror. That would be like calling the European theater in the Second World War the war on Blitzkrieg. That would be calling it a war on a tactic. And you cannot defeat a fanatical, determined enemy just by declaring war on a certain tactic. Take, for instance, the war in the Atlantic. Let's say that during World War II, the Western Allies had simply said that they were having a war against unrestricted U-boat warfare. Would that have been effectual? Would that have destroyed all of the Nazi fleet that was prowling in the waters of not only the North Atlantic, but also the Mediterranean and some of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea around Russia? The fact of the matter is, it wouldn't. It would have only gone after a certain element of it. In other words, if you are going to put yourself on a wartime footing, you absolutely must be able to clearly and unequivocally identify your enemy and commit yourself to the ultimate destruction and defeat of that enemy. That is why whenever you are going to bring an end to a war, you don't ask for conditional surrender. You ask for unconditional surrender. That has been the way that we have done things for generations. At the end of the war between the states, or the American Civil War, again, it was unconditional surrender that was asked for. It is unconditional surrender that was asked for in the Spanish-American War, and it was unconditional surrender that was asked for at the end of World War I and World War II. That is the definite pattern that cannot be denied when you are going to be successful in a wartime footing. Now, it's also important to remember that the United States of America has not been on an official wartime footing, and by that I mean in an actual officially declared war since World War II. That means that it has been over 70 years since Congress last declared war on a combatant and hostile nation. So therefore, when you look at groups such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the various other terrorist groups like Boko Haram and all of the other Islamo-fascists, we see that it is a different type of war, or it's certainly a different type of conflict. These are not organized nation states. They are terrorist groups that would be considered criminals or spies under the Geneva Convention because they don't march under a recognized uniform, and they don't, or rather they haven't agreed to the terms and conditions of the Geneva Convention. Therefore, these people can be shot on sight. We don't have to take them prisoner. We don't have to afford them or accord them the same types of privileges or rights that we would a standing army that is a signatory of the Geneva Convention. This is kind of the mindset that escapes the radical and extremist fringes of the left that don't want to face the reality that we are, in fact, in a fight for our survival, that these enemies have absolutely declared war on our very way of life. They don't want to admit that because it means that everything that they have been saying in their radical utopian socialist agenda would be disproven and false. You know what comes to mind, of course, is things like Burn Me Sanders going out in front of the cameras of the salivating mainstream media and saying that this so-called man-made global warming has caused Islamo-fascist terrorism. And that's the thing. Right from the president down to the Democratic candidates for the office of President of the United States refuse to actually come out and address who our enemy really is, that being Islamo-fascism. And then even on the Republican side, you have people like Marco Rubio and El Jefe Jebe Bush coming out and saying that we are at war with radical Islam. But this idea of what they're trying to frame this as really doesn't make any sense to me, because there isn't much proof other than a few groups here and there coming out and saying that they are moderate Muslims standing up to the Islamo-fascists who want to create a caliphate, which is an Islamic empire, so to say, that spreads throughout the entire globe. Now, this is where the thinking may become different. While ISIS is not a recognized state, the fact of the matter is they are referring to themselves as a state that is an Islamic state, a religious state, something that follows the death cult of the false moon god Allah. That is a reality that is different, something that we didn't face with Al-Qaeda, because I don't ever remember Al-Qaeda claiming to be a nation state. Now, it was a little bit different with respect to the Taliban when we first started going to war with Islamo-fascists in 2001 after those horrific and dastardly attacks of 9/11. The Taliban was a government that was ruling over Afghanistan. But again, we utilized essentially the War Powers Act to once again get around this notion of requiring Congress to declare war. It means that the way that the nation approaches our mission and our goals are completely different, because an official war gears the entire economy towards it. It gears our industry, what little bit we have left, towards it, and places the entire nation on what is known as a wartime footing. So during World War II, we would actually have all of our industrial capacity producing materiel for the war effort. So GM, Ford, and Chrysler were all making tanks, planes, munitions, and bombs. It just makes sense that that is what we did, because at that time, by actually going through the constitutional process of declaring war, we recognized that it was a fight for our life, that we were embroiled in a conflict, that the outcome would determine whether we would remain a free nation or not. Well, the stakes are the same here now, but our leadership just doesn't want to go down the path of the actual constitutional method of declaring war. And that would be, as the Constitution requires, having the legislative branch declare war at the request of the chief executive, being the President of the United States of America. That has been the traditional method, in fact, the constitutionally endowed method of placing America on a wartime footing. But as I said, the last time that the United States ever officially declared war, over 70 years ago, a lot of time has passed since then, and we have changed the outlook on it. And so every conflict that the United States has entered into post-World War II has been different. And we haven't really been able to hone in on the type of success that we managed in World War II. In Korea, we fought to a standstill, and it's still a ceasefire. In other words, that war is not entirely over. It's basically an agreement not to fire upon each other at the 38th parallel, which is the demilitarized zone that splits North and South Korea. In Vietnam, we backed out completely. Then there was the Gulf War, in which we were fairly successful, but we didn't push it all the way through to completely destroy the enemy. And that led to the second war in Iraq, which, with the surge, yes, we were proving to be victorious, but this current regime decided that it would score political points and push its radical extremist left-wing agenda and ideology by reversing the surge and by pulling us out. And as a result, we have seen the rise of the Islamic State, or ISIS or ISIL, whatever name you want to give it. That organization really believes that it will create in, I believe the town is called Al-Raqqa, a new caliphate that will be the end times, the end of the world, to bring about a global caliphate that dominates the entire world. Well, that is a twisted ideology. That is an ideology in which the people that are serving and fighting for it believe that they will go to paradise if they kill and terrorize as many of their enemy as they can. Meanwhile, you have the President of the United States going in front of the cameras of the salivating mainstream media and saying that this is a gun control issue, that ready access to military-style weapons, as he put it, is what is causing this mass carnage and chaos in the United States. That is a radical agenda which will do nothing but make the United States weaker. Again, pointing back to the annals of history in the Second World War, it was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto who said that if they attacked mainland America, meaning the continental United States, Japan would never win because there would be a sniper behind every blade of grass because the American people are endowed with their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear arms. Now, how did Isoroku Yamamoto have this significant insight into the psyche of the United States and into the national character and identity of the American people? Well, it's important to remember that a lot of the key Japanese commanders and military leaders during the Second World War had actually been educated in the United States. In fact, Yamamoto himself had attended Harvard University. So while he was engaging in his collegiate studies in the United States, he was exposed firsthand to what it is that drives the American people and what our character is. And our character has always been that we are a self-responsible, self-accountable, and relentless people, that we are independently minded, and that we have the ability to protect ourselves, and come hell or high water, the American people will never back down when it comes to a fight to protect their fundamental and unalienable rights, which are completely defined and protected by the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. So again, this is why Jeremy and I have so often reiterated on past episodes of the Wright Flyer that it is so significant and important that you gain a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution and thereby your fundamental and unalienable rights. In so doing, you are empowered to be the type of people that you actually are, because this is written on your hearts as it is a natural law principle. Our entire system of government and our entire constitutional system is based on natural law tenets, which are timeless, and therefore it is still within the beating hearts of every American citizen to be what it was that frightened Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and convinced him not to invade mainland America. And I know that a cynical left-winger might come out and say that it's a different time and that the Japanese were a different people. But do not forget that the World War II era Japanese were fanatically devoted to their emperor, who they considered to be a god, because the imperial line of Japan has been uninterrupted since the inception of that country. That means to say that unlike any of the other imperial dynasties, there has only ever been one in Japan, and it was said to have come from the head of the Shinto pantheon, the sun goddess Amaterasu. So therefore, the Japanese viewed it as a racial war of conquest, and that their life was insignificant or rather in comparison to the greatness of their living god emperor. That is why you had the kamikaze attacks, which started up during Okinawa, which was horrific. But that once again goes back into a historical mindset that the Japanese had with respect to the numerous invasions that were attempted to be made on that island nation by the Mongols. The term kamikaze, kame meaning God, kaze meaning wind, means the divine wind. So what had happened when the Mongols had attempted to invade mainland Japan on at least two separate occasions is these massive typhoons came into the Sea of Japan and completely destroyed the invasion fleets. And so, once again, the Japanese, which still were going off of the old Code of Bushido, or really kind of a bastardized form of it, were they would kill themselves if they dishonored themselves, and they thought that dying was more honorable than living. So when you look at that and compare it to the type of ideology that we are facing with the Islamic State, you see some rather startling similarities, in so much as the ISIS members really believe that they will go to a better place if they sacrifice themselves in this war against the West and Western values and anything that doesn't adhere to their medieval ideology with respect to Islamofascism. That is the danger that we're facing. We called the kamikazes and the way that the Japanese would go on so-called bonsai suicide charges fanatical. We knew that they were a fanatical enemy that was hell-bent on our complete and total destruction. Well, that is the same type of fanaticism that we are facing with ISIS. But the President of the United States doesn't seem to care what great lengths the enemy is willing to go to in order to destroy our Western way of life. And part of the problem is that the president himself is diametrically opposed to everything that is good and decent about the United States of America. So what we are actually facing is this dichotomy that the United States has never faced in its long and illustrious history. We have not once had a leader that was so completely devoted to the dismantling of our natural law system as contained and underpinning our shared United States Constitution. And that is a truly dangerous situation. Now, why did I delve into this little history lesson? Well, it's because more information is coming out about the terrorist mastermind Saeed Farouk and his wife Kashfin Malik. Apparently, we now know that Saeed threatened on several occasions to kill Jews because he had, like most of these Islamofascists, this radical and rather unsettling hatred of Jews. And he also said that Islam will rule the world. There you have it, folks. There is the ideology that we're facing. These are the types of people that are willing to destroy us. They are willing to use our fundamental and unalienable rights against us. They are willing to strike out in the ways that they are in the hopes that our political powers that be will do the predictable thing that all utopian socialist types of groups do in disarming the people, as the president has proposed. And then they've even got this type of collaboration going on with respect to the Department of Justice with the Attorney General going out and saying that she would prosecute anyone that, spoke out against Islamofascism if she thought that it would go towards violence or create some sort of a backlash against the so-called moderate Muslims here in the United States. So again, we have leaders that are just playing into the hands of these Islamofascists who want nothing less than the absolute annihilation and destruction of the United States of America and indeed the entire Western world. And we can't ignore this. We cannot ignore this because it is to our direct peril to do so. Yet, Obama is doubling down on his agenda to strip us of our firearms. Even after it was announced that the attacks in San Bernardino, California, were directly tied to the Islamic State. You know, the thing that Obama has been wrong about every time that he's opened his mouth with respect to it. He was not going out and admitting that we are facing an enemy that is unified to destroy us, that is determined to destroy us. No, he was sitting down to meet with Gabby Giffords, that congresswoman, or I can't remember if she was a senator. I think she was just a congresswoman that was shot back during his first term in order to try and push this wild anti-gun agenda. Folks, we need to take a step back for a moment and consider this fact. Obama wants to flood this country with so-called Syrian refugees while at the same time deprive law-abiding American citizens who are the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in the United States of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms. This is the type of disconnect that really does place the United States of America at even greater risk than we currently are. And it is shocking and intolerable that the president would go out and double down on these efforts when that is clearly not the cause of the problem, and any of his so-called solutions actually wouldn't address the violent terrorist attacks that have been orchestrated and unleashed against the United States of America and her people. But you know, folks, there's more to it. We now know that the Department of Homeland Security, that bureaucracy that was created in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks 14 plus years ago, has no strategy currently for attacking Islamofascists. And the reason that they don't have any strategy for this is that Obama has had them committed to finding ways to get illegal aliens here under refugee status, like what we saw with Jed Johnson last year, and those so-called unaccompanied minors that came in as illegal aliens that we're now going to give them asylum, and they've been spread throughout the country. And again, there has been no background or vetting. And we already know that there have been ISIS members who have penetrated our porous southern border in that fashion, at least according to the FBI. And so Homeland Security has been focused on dismantling our borders, dismantling our sovereignty, and putting us in a weaker position. And therefore, when it comes to these real threats to the United States of America and its population, they are left dumbfounded because they absolutely have no strategy whatsoever to address it. And that is another danger that we are facing. And it is also a direct consequence of the radical extremist left-wing agenda that has been embraced by the Obama regime from top to bottom. And that has exposed us to even greater danger. Yet the salivating mainstream media is doing nothing to bring this to light, is doing nothing to cover it, and is once again doubling down, just like the president is, on this attack on the fundamental and unalienable rights of the citizenry to keep and bear firearms. This is a delusional type of cabal that exists in the United States right now, and it is putting each and every one of us at significant risk for harm. Yet, the political powers that be continue to march down the same avenue that they have been from day one. It shows that the current political powers that be and those elitists, as well as the detente wing of the gutless opposition party, loathe and despise the American people. They don't believe that we should be protected, and they think that they can secure their own power, which they have illicitly amassed for themselves at the expense of the true sovereigns, we the people, by flooding this country. This is about the type of fundamental transformation that Obama really meant. It is not about so much beginning the transformation with the country itself, which he has already started. Look at Obamacare and look at his other failed policies. But their ultimate goal is to completely tear apart our shared United States Constitution by obliterating the people of the United States. When he sits there and says that racism is in the DNA of America and therefore it cannot be cured, what he's really saying is that these notions of liberty, the independent mindedness that Admiral Yamamoto noticed and feared, is in the DNA of the American people and cannot be taken away unless they are replaced. Now, all of a sudden, this vast commitment to flooding our country with these illegal aliens and with these so-called Syrian refugees makes more sense. He arrogantly believes that he can change our destiny and our national character, spirit, heritage, and identity by replacing us. Because those people that they're bringing in don't have the same type of allegiance that we do to our shared United States Constitution. They lack an understanding of our fundamental and unalienable rights, and thereby they lack any appreciation for it, and therefore they would also be willing to allow that to be stripped away because it has no meaning to them. They don't want to assimilate and become part of our culture and society, and thereby our people. And so, once again, this is part of Obama's fundamental transformation of the United States of America. And it is the one promise that he has stayed completely true to. He will go forth with it, double down on it, and recommit himself to it at every given opportunity. And we have seen it with the Bo Bergdahl case, where he traded 5 of the terrorist masterminds, some of whom were behind the planning and logistics of the September 11th attacks of 2001, for a so-called prisoner of war who has a questionable record, someone whom his fellow servicemen had accused of desertion. That's who we traded for. And that, of course, is Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. And again, the way that the regime has handled this entire issue has been to keep things under wraps, to keep things out of the hands of the American public. And it goes back also to the way that he reacted at the time that we took out Osama bin Laden. He refused to show pictures to the American people so that we could get that ultimate closure, knowing that we had destroyed the man who had planned the attack, who had funded the attack, and who had created the organization that carried out the attack, which was the worst terrorist attack on American soil ever. And now, under his leadership, if we can even call the way Obama supposedly runs this country leadership, we have suffered the second greatest terrorist attack since 9/11, the worst terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11, and he wants to go out and grab our guns. Folks, again, that is a complete disconnect from reality, and it shows that he is completely incapable and unwilling of divorcing himself from his radical extremist left-wing ideology. And of course, that once again places us in grave and significant danger. You know, there was another thing that Obama came out and claimed immediately after the horrific terrorist attacks that unfurled in Paris, France, which was the worst attack on French soil since World War II, when he came out and said that ISIS is contained. Well, now there are reports coming out saying that ISIS has weapons of mass destruction in Europe. Europe is now on a complete lockdown mode, basically, with respect to what's happening. But again, they had these lax immigration policies with respect to these so-called Islamic refugees that has opened them up to these kinds of danger. And as I have said on previous episodes of the Wright Flyer, there were terrorists that had masqueraded as so-called Syrian refugees that had carried out that dastardly attack in Paris, France. And again, I have to repeat this idea and notion that the way the president is trying to go after our fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms, which is the best right which can be utilized by the sovereigns of America, we the people, to defend ourselves, is what he's going after. But if you look at what happened in France, they were completely and totally anti-gun, and it didn't work for them. It exacerbated the problem. It made them less safe, and that is the unquestionable reality that we in the West are going to have to come to grips with. Because if we do not, then ISIS will be able to march lockstep with their ideology. They will be able to amass success after success at the expense of the civilized world, and we will all be the ones to suffer as a direct consequence therefrom. But again, Obama is asleep at the helm because he doesn't want to admit that Islamo-fascist terrorism is a threat, that these people hail from a foreign and alien ideology that has no method or mode of compatibility with our Western philosophy and thought. And that is a significant problem, because it means that the so-called leader of the free world is basking in this intentionally, willfully blind delusion that is not only placing the United States at significant risk, but it is placing the entire Western world at significant risk. To give you a sense of just how out of touch President Obama is on this issue, he is expecting to be given a speech in the Oval Office on Sunday, December 6th. Now, you know, this is an important date because it's the day before Pearl Harbor Day. Sunday, December 6th, to finally discuss terrorism and the threat that it poses. But you know he's probably going to interlace some anti-gun agenda into his talking points with respect to this speech. But we have to remember that these attacks occurred several days ago. This is not the type of reaction time that one would come to expect. And it reminds me of the way that the mainstream media lashed out at President Bush in the time of the 9/11 attacks back in 2001. They said that he should have just dropped everything when he was in front of those young students, thereby causing even greater and unwarranted fear for them, and immediately acted. But I'm not hearing the same type of anger that they had with Bush with respect to Obama. They're not going out and condemning him, whereas Bush was, delayed by a couple of hours? And here's Obama delayed by several days. You see, once again, it shows that there is this unacceptable double standard that exists with respect to the mainstream media, and this is putting all of us at grave and significant danger, and yet the media doesn't want to admit that they are part of the problem, that they have helped contribute to what it is that has made the United States of America weaker, that has exposed us to these sorts of rejuvenated terrorist attacks, and has left the American people feeling isolated and alone. Because if you stop and think about it, the one thing that the federal government is absolutely supposed to do is to secure the borders of the United States. And folks, there can be no denial about this, that ever since President Obama assumed the reins of power back in January of 2009, there has been no effort to protect the border. Now, to be fair, there had been really no effort to protect the border under George W. Bush, but it was accelerated under this Obama administration. And that's the thing that the left doesn't want to admit here in America. You can't just keep passing the buck to the past presidency or the past administration. At some point, you have to start accepting responsibility for yourself, because your policies have now ultimately taken center stage and have played their effect on the country at large. Because let's face it, the Obama administration has been in power since January of 2009. That has been 6 years. That is over a half decade. It is time to now point and hold accountable those that are actually responsible for what is happening in the government now. Because clearly, we are now suffering the brunt and burden of the consequences of Obama's failed policy decisions, both abroad and at home. But again, the mainstream media doesn't want to speak to that. They want to continue to claim that it's radical right-wingers that pose the greatest threat to the United States. They want to say that it's Republicans that pose this threat. Well, in a way, they're right. The detente wing of the gutless opposition party that has completely collaborated with the Obama administration and its radical attempts to fundamentally transform the United States have been harmful to the United States, but that's not how the media would want to spin it. That is not how they would want to portray it, because that would go against their propagandistic message that they are wholeheartedly dedicated to. So when we are seeing all of these terrible things bubbling out of control, we have to really try and discern what it is that composes the root cause of this. Well, folks, the root cause of this is the fact that our government, whether it's the federal government or whether it's municipal, through county, through state, on up, has divorced itself from strict adherence to the fundamental natural law tenets contained within the four corners of our shared Constitution. For a great example of this, Obama's plan to just bring in all these so-called Syrian refugees through executive order, changing the interpretation of the Refugee Act, that is a sign of a president changing the meaning of a law, which is something that an executive order cannot do, in order to flood this country with these so-called Syrian refugees. And he has been completely intellectually disingenuous about this by saying that it's like the Christians that have been wiped out in the region. No, of all the 10,000 that he's wanting to bring in by the start of next year, not a single one of them are Christian. They are all Sunni Muslims. And it's important to remember that ISIS is composed of Sunni Muslims, and that they are based off of a Sunni ideology and vision of Islam. That is another one of those key pieces of the truth, of that puzzle of truth that the mainstream media is attempting to hide from the American people, because they don't want the American people to realize just what a significant risk is posed by these so-called refugees. Instead, they try and weave these stories that it's somehow compassionate to be that way. And then these same radical extremist left-wingers who came out and said that God isn't fixing this problem, said that it's the Christian thing to do to bring in these so-called Syrian refugees. That is the absolute epitome of hypocrisy. And it shows that these people will say and do anything that will front and push forward their radical utopian socialist agenda. And of course, that agenda is always working to the great detriment of we the people, the ultimate wielders of sovereignty here in the United States. But they ignore this fact because they are so committed to their radical ideology that it is beyond belief. It is absolutely beyond belief, except that when you stop and realize that what these people are attempting to accomplish is to create this collectivist mentality to replace the natural law tenets that underpin our shared United States Constitution, to strip and deprive us of our fundamental and unalienable rights, you find that they aren't that different than the Islamo-fascists. Because when you look at the type of mindset that Islam has, it based on Sharia law is a collectivist type of mentality. They work for the collective benefit of Islam. When you slander the Prophet, it's not that it's offending individual Muslims per se. It's that it is offending the collective identity of Islam together. So, again, it makes a bit of sense when you realize that these utopian socialists, who are basically a form of fascism, which is they want to control the entire economy and the means of production to such an extent to where it looks as though it is being done through privately owned corporations, but in fact, through government regulation, they are using it for their own purposes and benefits, and pushing for a collective identity. Fascism is like that. So is socialism, so is Marxism, so is Islamo-fascism. And so this is the threat that we're facing in the United States right now. And of course, the mainstream media is doing everything in its power to obfuscate and hide this fact from the American people. And it is completely intellectually disingenuous on their part. But nevertheless, they are doubling down on their rhetoric. They are doubling down on their attempts to besmirch and belittle the American people. And they do it because they think that they can accomplish their goals. They have never been as close as they are right now to completely accomplishing their goals of fundamentally transforming the United States of America. That is why they were so jubilant when President Obama won his second term back in 2012. Of course, the gutless opposition party didn't do us any favors by running Mittens Romneykins as the candidate. You know, folks, it wasn't even until 2 days after the terrorist attacks occurred in San Bernardino, California, that President Obama finally came out and admitted that it could be terrorism. And I mean, it's just shocking to hear his own words with respect to this issue.
Danger of people succumbing to violent extremist ideologies. We know that ISIL and other terrorist groups are actively encouraging people around the world and in our country to commit terrible acts of violence, oftentimes as lone wolf actors. And even as we work to prevent attacks, all of us, government, law enforcement, communities, faith leaders, need to work together to prevent people from falling victim to these hateful ideologies.
Okay, from that point, we see that he is basically online speaking about what we should be doing, but it doesn't take long for him to switch the entire impetus of what he was saying back to stripping American citizens of their fundamental and unalienable right to keep and bear firearms.
That the killers in San Bernardino used military-style assault weapons, weapons of war, to kill as many people as they could. It's another tragic reminder that here in America, it's way too easy for dangerous people to get their hands on a gun.
There it is, folks. There's your disconnect. There is where Obama once again goes out and tries to blame this on the fundamental and unalienable right of the people to keep and bear firearms. He says that it's too easy to get military-style weapons, as he put it, here in the United States. But once again, looking back to the dastardly terrorist attacks, which were the worst on French soil since World War II, that unfurled in Paris just a while back, that country doesn't allow their citizens to have firearms. Did that prevent the Islamo-fascist terrorists from carrying out their attacks? No. And then, of course, when the president speaks out about saying that the pattern of gun violence in the United States is unprecedented to anywhere else in the world, I again point back to the multiple cases of mass shootings that occurred in France from Islamo-fascists, and that was once again in a country with strict gun control. Let's talk about the Norwegian case that happened, I think, a few years back, that was the actual worst recorded ever in the history of mankind mass shooting, with over 68 people dead, I believe it was. That was in Norway, another country with extremely strict gun control laws and measures. See, again, this is the type of intellectually disingenuous argument that is put forward by the radical extremist fringes of the left wing that does not take into account reality. But then again, nothing with respect to the radical extreme left and these utopian socialists is ever based in reality. Their arguments are always based on raw emotionalism, and that is detrimental to the country at large. But more so, it is just detrimental to freedom at large. You see that with the ideology of the radical and extreme left, you have this desire to clamp down on people, to silence people, to prosecute those who think differently than you do. We see it with this rash wave of carnage, there's just chaos spreading through our institutions of higher education here in the United States, where people in my generation, I'll admit it, I'm a millennial, but I'm not your typical type of millennial, want to go out and silence those that they disagree with. There is a significant threat to our freedom of expression here in the United States. It has been fostered by the current political powers that be, and never before has the First Amendment in living memory come under as grave of danger and threat as it has right now. And it is our responsibility to safeguard our freedom of speech, our fundamental and unalienable rights that we have that are found within the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which is known as the Bill of Rights. Again, it's because when you go back to the inception of the United States of America, going back over 2 centuries ago to the American War of Independence, the natural law tenets which underpin our shared United States Constitution requires that we be proactive, because we are the ultimate wielders and arbiters of sovereignty here in the United States. When you look at what it is that was said at that time, it was a delegation of absolute power and authority on the part of the absolute sovereigns, we the people, to the federal government through several multi-tiered steps of delegation. First, it was delegated to the several states which acted in a representative capacity for the American people. Then, through the Constitutional Convention, they had delegates that represented the people once again. So all of the delegation of power comes from the ultimate root of sovereignty, we, the people. But would you know that, going off of the messages that are being spun by the mainstream media? Would you know that from the Common Core education version of American history? No. No, because the revisionists are trying to rewrite it as that we should just ignore our founding fathers because they were these evil, white, slave-holding males that had just gone out of their way to oppress everyone else. Now, does that sound realistic? Of course not. It's two-dimensional. It's a cartoon. It's a caricature of real history. It doesn't cover the multifaceted, complex truth. But the fact of the matter is, what motivated the Founding Fathers and what underpins our entire constitutional federalist representative Republican system of government is timeless because it is based on natural law. This is what they don't want you to know. This is what they go to such extreme measures to try and obfuscate and hide from the American people. That is the danger that we are currently facing in the United States right now. And they are doubling down on their efforts, and this complacent mainstream media that salivates and dances to every tune that they play is helping them. And I'm sorry, but when I look at the gutless opposition party, I am not seeing any effort other than by Ted Cruz to stand up to the threat that faces the United States right now. Folks, all of this looks dark and damning and makes it feel as though there is no way that the United States of America can ever pull itself out of this dark and dank hole that these utopian socialists have put us in. But again, that is not the case. It just is not, because we have the solution. We've had it for over 200 years. That is our shared United States Constitution. The Constitution of the United States belongs to you and me, not to these wannabe potentates, despots, tyrants, and oppressors. Not to these zealots of radical extremist left-wing ideology. No, the Constitution belongs to we the people. The very ones who delegated their power to create this government in the first place. And it holds the key to the salvation of the United States. Because if we return every branch of government, every level of government, back to strict adherence to the fundamental tenets that are contained within the four corners of the United States Constitution, you will see this country begin to return to prosperity. An American Renaissance, the likes of which this nation has not known in its long and illustrious history, will boom, and we will once again begin to be that great and prosperous nation that we were always meant to be. And the reason that we would return to that is because the principles that are within the United States Constitution are divinely inspired by Providence. That is why it is such a beautiful social compact. It is the greatest contract ever penned by the hands of men. Now, humanity is incapable of achieving perfection, but the United States Constitution is the closest thing that we have ever come to obtaining and achieving absolute perfection. And we are so fortunate to be the beneficiaries of this greatest inheritance of any people on the face of the planet. That is because we were born or naturalized as American citizens. And so therefore, it is so important, again, to adhere to the principles that are contained within the four corners of that sacred document, because it is what defines us as a nation and a people. And that's what makes this idea of just allowing more and more illegal aliens to come into this country, to give them carte blanche amnesty, and to flood our borders with the so-called Syrian refugees would just be devastating to the country at large, because it works against our national character, heritage, spirit, and identity. That is the major conflict that exists between the utopian socialists and those of us in America who want to adhere to and preserve our fundamental and unalienable rights, because they don't like our national identity. And you can see this from the attempts to create balkanization here in the United States. President Obama wanting to delve into this disastrous notion of identity politics to further divide and conquer the American people. Why would he do that? Well, once again, it plays into this idea that he wants to fundamentally transform the United States of America. But we can't accept that. We cannot bow to that. We cannot capitulate to that, because in so doing, we would deprive ourselves of our sovereignty. And as I have stated so frequently, we, the people, are the ultimate wielders of sovereignty in the United States. The government does not own this country. We do. The government does not own us. The government works for us, not the other way around. But the way things exist in the status quo right now, no one would know that. The ultimate power wielded by unconstitutional organizations such as the Internal Revenue Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, all of these various ABC governmental bureaucracies that are ultimately nameless, faceless, and unaccountable to the American people, wield a type of power that was never intended to be given to the federal government, that was never meant to be utilized or orchestrated or used against we the people, because we the people of the United States of America are the ultimate sovereigns in this country. That is the ultimate truth that our founding fathers had, and that is why these this historical revisionists that are doing everything to wipe out and eradicate the true and noble history of the United States are trying to snuff out, because they want to replace it with this dark, dank, hopeless message that they have been pushing for so long now. And that's why you're seeing the millennial generation come out so confused. It is because we have been taught from day one that our country is a wicked and evil place. And those who don't go out and do their own research, as I have, fail to recognize that what the institutions of education, from primary all the way to postgraduate school, have done is lied to us. They have lied to us. They have tried to teach us that we are deserving of a lesser status in the world because we gained such a prominent position in the geopolitical sphere and in the history of humanity because we were rotten, degenerate people that stole from truly innocent, angelic peoples who had never done anything wrong. And that all of our enemies were justified to stand against us because we were this awesome juggernaut of power that is the bane of humanity, that we have created all of the environmental destruction that exists in the world, that we are the root of all problems in the world. Now, yes, if that sounds two-dimensional, it's because it is. If it sounds like a straw man argument, it's because it is. But that is what they teach as truth. And once again, they say, okay, all right, if you're going to argue that the fundamental and unalienable rights of the American people are a good thing, okay, but they're quaint, they're outdated, they're 18th century. Come on, grow up, get with the times. This is the 21st century. Why are we dwelling on something that happened over 200 years ago? And what they fail to do is to realize that the natural law tenets that underpin our entire constitutional system of government, our representative republic, are timeless. They apply just as much today as they did 200 plus years ago. And they will apply just as much 200 plus years from now as they do today. But they can't wrap their heads around this, because what they ultimately want is a command-style government, so centralized that all decisions are made just from the top and handed down so that they don't have to think for themselves, that someone smarter than they are, or at least who they perceive to be smarter than they are, will hand down these decisions. I actually had a professor who taught a required course when I was in college, and this was back in 2004, so we're talking 11 years ago, who sat there and said that, yeah, it's a neat idea what the United States Constitution is, but the problem with it is it just doesn't take into account how stupid the people are. Folks, that right there is the arrogance that is espoused by these utopian socialists. That is the type of arrogance that continues to foster, support, encourage, and spread this radical ideology that threatens to destroy the very societal fabric of the United States of America. And that is what millennials have heard on a daily basis for years, for all of their lives. That is all they have heard. But it is not the truth. And those that have gone and done their own research, as I have, and as Jeremy has, will find that this is not the reality that exists in this world, that the primary sources say a different thing, and that there are blemishes on these so-called angelic people that we stole from. And actually, when they say that we steal land, like let's take the Gadsden Purchase for example, at the end of the Mexican-American War of the 1840s, we purchased that land, yet they say we stole it. Can you name any other nation on the face of the planet throughout the history of humanity that really paid for the lands that they occupied after a war, after successfully completing and winning a war? I can tell you right here and right now, that is unprecedented in all of world history. We were the first to do it. Why? Because we adhered to these natural law principles that underpin our shared United States Constitution. Now, did we have dark moments in our history? Yes, of course. There are no people on the face of the planet that have never gone through dark periods of history. There has never been a time when we weren't mistaken about something. We are still mistaken about many things, and yet we are completely oblivious to the fact that future generations might throw stones at us just as we have at past generations, that future generations might try and rewrite our history to paint us as the types of bigots that we claim to be fighting against. Because when you actually look at the truth of this cancerous notion of political correctness, you will see that it is just Jim Crow laws in blackface. Now, I know that sounds offensive, and I quite frankly don't care, because I meant it to be offensive. I meant it to show that they are just as degenerate as they claim to, or, you know, as the forces that they claim to fight, as the twisted ideology that they claim is still prevalent here in the country. Last I checked, Jim Crow has not been at the helm of any state in the United States since the 1950s, since the time of the Civil Rights Acts. But again, this is part of the historical revisionism that is going on unabated in the United States of America right now. This is part of their plan to rewrite it, to make it seem as though slavery is still occurring here in the United States as we speak. Now, they don't want to speak out against the Islamo-fascists who are currently practicing slavery right now, today, as we speak, as we breathe and live here right now in the present day. No, they don't want to point to them, because they, you know, they're just these poor, misunderstood people that have been driven to these so-called radical stances and circumstances due to droughts that have popped up due to man, you know, pouring so much carbon fiber or whatever the hell it is into the air, making the globe deflate, and therefore they don't have water, and they're just poor, and they're just misunderstood. That's the fairy tale that revisionism teaches. They claim that slavery, which hasn't existed in the United States in about 150 years, and no one who is alive today in the United States that was born in the United States was ever a slave. No one today even had grandparents who were born slaves. No, that has passed. That era is gone, completely gone. But they act as though that is terrible, and they completely shrug off the fact that the Islamo-fascists, who are going out and shooting and killing American people on American soil, who practice slavery today, no, they're just misunderstood. It's just global warming. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. This is the type of extremism that we see from the left wing, and it is a type of willful blindness to the forces that are actually out to kill us that these people are ignoring. And they ignore it because they have their own radical and twisted agenda that they cannot tear themselves away from. We see it with the president. We see it with Loretta Lynch. We see it with all of the political correct indoctrination that is going on in institutions of higher education and indeed all institutions of education throughout the United States. And that is the reality that we face. But again, folks, if we embrace the natural law tenets that are contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, and we force the government back into strict adherence to those principles contained within it, we can turn this country around. That is the message of hope that I want to give you. With that said, it is time to begin our descent. I'm going to send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. I want to thank you again for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer, and I hope to see you again next time. I also invite you to leave comments here on our YouTube page or on our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. This is your Captain, Randy Wright, wishing you a very Merry Christmas and hoping to see you the next time that Jeremy and I take to the friendly skies, leaving you with an indelible yet pure sense of enlightenment. See you next time. Merry Christmas, ladies and gentlemen. Do take care.